Okay, so let's start with just talking about the European Union, what it is, why it was founded, um, and how it's important. Does anyone want to start off with like a quick, brief explanation of like what the EU is? I think we should have like a general idea of like the premise behind it. Anyone?
It's just like I don't know the term for, yeah, union, I guess, between a bunch of different European countries to try to help with free trade.
Yeah, so that's like a fantastic explanation, right? It's it Free trade was like honestly a big principle behind that, right? And so the free movement of goods and people is like the core idea behind the European Union. When you think of the United States of America, you think of one big country and a global superpower. But if you had thought of it as just 50 different countries or like states as countries, then it would not be as strong because there's nothing unifying them together, no federal oversight. Everyone's doing their own thing. They might have different agendas. And so as a result of that, the European Union thought it'd be a good idea to bind together and, of course, allow their countries to have some sort of their own, like their sovereign rights, right? They can still control their parts of their economy, their domestic policies, but like then the EU still has to provide some regulations, and there are some aspects of their, domestic policies that are heavily influenced or controlled by the European Union. So let's start with just like the free movement of goods and people, because essentially right now in the EU, there's no border controls between any countries. This means if you have a passport from Germany, that passport will not be checked if you're traveling to Spain, for example, because that's another EU country. You could just take a train, go to Spain, live there, and you should be fine. Work there, you should be fine. Um, and as a result of that, you can import goods from other countries and also not be charged tariffs, or customs doesn't have to necessarily check your goods because again, it's like an open country. If I go from New York to New Jersey, for example, you don't again have to like pay taxes or tariffs for goods. You don't have to be checked for customs. You don't have to like be checked by your passport, stuff like that. Um, so that's one of the big pros of the EU. Living in the EU is a big convenience because you can travel to the country that's neighboring to you without any restrictions. Even traveling to Canada from the United States is a big process, right? In Mexico, of course. Um, so that this essentially results in a common market, right? Um, and they have to adhere to the rules of the customs union, a set of standardized regulations for all goods sold anywhere in the EU. So because there's this one big market across the European Union, which is a big pro, right? Because for a small business starting up in Spain, for example, you can get products from France and you have no problems. But again, you have to follow the rules of the EU. It's like international trade rules, but again, it's like the federal rules of the United States between states. You have to follow these rules no matter what. And then the EU also sets the macroeconomic policies or fiscal, monetary policies across the uh, country, or like the union, rather. Um, it's like the United States Federal Reserve increasing or decreasing interest rates. Similarly, the European Union sets their own interest rates, which are followed by the entirety of the European Union. Um, and then member states must have their budget approved by the EU every year and continue to abide by the strict fiscal responsibility requirements. So this is a good thing because we can make sure that like countries that might be faltering economically or have slow economic growth aren't continuing to dig themselves in a deeper hole, and the European Union can make sure that their economy is stable, which they really need to, because we'll talk about the conflicts between like having multiple different economies under their one union later on in this presentation. Okay, this is a great article on how the European Union works, basically talking about all like the uh, groups and legislative bodies that are like used in the European Union, such as like the European Council, European Commission, and of course like the judicial and legislative sides to it. And then it goes into somewhat of a history behind that. So that is a very important aspect of like the European Union. It's like they have their own committees and like uh, meetings so that they can make sure that every country's agenda is followed. Um, and so basically that's a key part of the European Union. That's a great link for you guys to use. I can copy and paste that into um, a chat link for you guys. Give me 1 second. Um, there we go. Piyush, you asked how much harder does it make to trade with the EU if a country such as Britain leaves, and we'll talk about that later. I do have a section on Brexit, so we'll get into that in a second. Don't you worry. That is a whole fiasco that we have to deal with. Okay, so that chat link should have been put into the Zoom. And then, of course, there's the Eurozone. So does anyone know anything about the Euro? Or like what it is? It's pretty straightforward.
Currency that is commonly used throughout the European Union, right? Like through international and within domestic EU markets.
Yeah. So basically, the euro is like the currency that is used by a majority of the European Union. Believe it or not, I think there are 9 countries that don't use the euro, of which one was the UK. So like technically, there's only 8 now because they left the European Union. Um, what that means is, again, it's a lot easier for smaller businesses to start up, right? Think about it logically. If I have a small business that's starting up, I might have to do a lot of currency like transactions and like work with that currency, or like do exchange rates, work with those if I need to trade between countries. But if I'm in the EU, then neighboring countries are completely fine if I'm exporting goods and stuff like that. What it also does is provide a larger market, right? You're basing your prices off the euro. You can make sure that you can track like how well the euro is doing and adjust your prices based off that and inflation and whatnot. And as a result, you have a larger market available to you, as once again, people can just travel freely in and out of countries. And then you have stability, right? Having the euro is a very stable currency, because think about currencies such as like Venezuela's currency. Because they had their own currency, they could do whatever they want, and that one government ruined that currency by like massively inflating it. What that means is, since like the euro is not technically under the control of just that one country and it's influenced by the entire European Union, it provides a more stable currency for those less stable economies in the European Union, for like Greece, for example, because they're using euros for their economy. They can still make sure that their currency is not devalued over time. And then the euro also helps offset weaker economies, because if you think of like stronger economies within the European Union, such as like Germany, for example, which has oftentimes been like an anchor for the European Union's economy, you can see that those weaker economies get offset by those stronger economies, because again, they're in the same market, and it impacts like macroeconomic policies. Okay, this is a good article about unemployment rates in the EU, and it shows how split they really are. Again, once this presentation is shared with you, you can click on it. It's a great resource, and we'll talk about conflicts that arise from that because of it. So this is a picture of like a typical Eastern European country, right? These Eastern European countries have more agrarian economies. Does anyone know what that means?
Based around agriculture?
Exactly. Yep. So Eastern European countries have more agricultural developed, dependent economies, which is not entirely a great thing, because, right, when in a world where globalization and like technological advancements and achievements are becoming more and more important, agrarian economies are starting to struggle, and especially because these don't have the manufacturing powers of like having, larger scale agriculture, like dependency, then like you can make sure that like the agrarian economy will continue to like suffer or like shrink, because again, if you have larger scale operations, you are able to keep up with the curve of like how the economy is functioning. Okay, let's talk about the East versus West conflict that arises because of it. So again, Eastern Europe has a lot of agrarian economies with lesser manufacturing, which means, again, less developed infrastructure, fewer technological advancements, highways, paved roads, fewer regulations in those countries, because of the fact that, people in these countries oftentimes have to have like a side hustle, for example. I remember someone telling me that they went visited Romania, um, and she told me that like people in Romania had like moonshine businesses as like a side hustle, and while those countries are able to like accommodate that and just let that slide, because like having a side hustle is so important to be like financially stable in those countries, what it means is that those countries just have fewer regulations, and that's a problem, right? We'll talk about that when we get to the Western European side, and that causes conflict too. um, Oftentimes they're born as like brain dead as young. That's what they've been described as in some articles. Um, and educated residents tend to move westward because that's where a lot of the education lies. And so that's a problem there. Um, uh, the Western European countries have more manufacturing, service based economies. And does anyone know what a service economy is?
It's one like the United States with items such as teaching professions, medical professions, law positions, etc.
So the service economy is more like to serve people like um, uh, restaurants, hotels, stuff like that. That's what it's typically more viewed as. And it's like especially like the southern Western Europe, right? And so those are like more like tourism based, which is like a very, very like it's very indicative of like a service economy, right? So in comparison to the Eastern European countries, these countries have more regulations. Could you imagine why that causes problems? Does anyone have any ideas why some people living in Western Europe might have problems with like tighter regulations? Or let's start with this. Who sets these regulations? Well, what did we talk about earlier, right? The EU has like tight economic regulations, right? So who would be setting these regulations across the entire European Union? Okay, well, the answer is actually like the European Union itself. And so when these Eastern European countries don't exactly follow these regulations, that not only angers the European Union because like why are they not following regulations we've said, but also Western European countries because now these businesses have to continue to survive in an economy with tighter regulations. Whereas they look eastward and they see, look, these businesses are doing just fine selling moonshine, for example, and I don't have to like, I have to follow these regulations that essentially hurt my profits, and I could be making more money. And so as a result, not only is there like tension between these countries, like culturally, but also when these Eastern Europeans migrate towards like the Western countries, there's a lot of resentment against these migrants. Because they're taking a lot of like lower paying jobs and like essentially taking advantage of like social welfare programs that are strong in Western European countries, which increase the costs of like the general public in the area. And then there's also a conflict between the North and the South here. So Northern Europe is typically seen as like more educated, highly educated, have more manufacturing economies. They're more resistant to recessions because they have like funds set up in like scenarios where like if there's a financial like recession, then these countries already have like funds set aside in order to make sure that every like person in their country could like have sufficient amounts of money to get through that recession, and they have wealthier populations and they were the ones who provided bailouts during the 2013 um, financial crisis. Like they had to like um, spend their money to provide those bailouts. Whereas Southern Europe have a lesser educated crowd. They're more service oriented, again, like restaurants, hotels, retail. They're more susceptible to recessions because when you think about it, during a recession, you have less of a disposable income, right? During a recession, I'm not going to be going spending my money on like unnecessary clothes. Whereas when the economy is doing well, I will. And as a result, since most of these like economies are focused around those not necessarily necessities, but more so like luxuries, like restaurants, hotels, retail, then these services and industries tend to fail during recessions harder than manufacturing industries. Um, And then there's lower income populations in these areas, and these are the countries that receive the bailouts. So as you can tell, there probably might be a stigma against these countries because the Northern Europeans had to provide money to them just so that they could survive. And as you could imagine, the Northern Europeans were probably not happy about that. Does anyone have any questions between regional conflicts within the EU? No? Okay, cool. Next, we have political nationalism, and we'll kind of get into this as we talk about something called a liberal democracy. But nationalism has been a major force in European politics since the end of World War I, right? Many ethnic groups had been conquered and oppressed and become independent countries and unified, and large empires collapsed. And like the unification of Italy and Germany was a huge thing. You can learn more about like the foreign policy section of like Tanner's lecture, which is I think the next lecture section we have. But as a result, like we've caused like a lot of nationalist movements across the European Union, right? Let's look at the East. These countries lost their independence when they become like satellite states of the Soviet Union, right? The Soviet Union ended up like poaching a lot of these states and like joining like them together into the Soviet Union. And so they basically had no independence under the Soviet Union. And what they see in the European Union is a lot more independence. But in order to like conquer that, right, the populace in these countries have like gone through a huge shift culturally, politically, and in terms of like their independence in general, right? What they want is like a strong sense of independence, and like independence is something that they might not get under the European Union because, as we talked about earlier, there are so many regulations under the Union. So as a result, we're seeing countries like Poland, Italy, and Turkey having a lot of like illiberal democracies, which we'll get into later on, as I explained. Um, and then, yeah, once again, like people are not only seeing that the European Union is like the same thing as the USSR, but are now trying to like latch off of that, and that's causing problems. Okay, the migration crisis. Does anyone want to look up these questions? Let's start with number one. Who wants to look up how many migrants came into the European Union last year and where did they go? Does anyone want to volunteer to look that up real quick?
I can do it.
Okay, cool. Grace, you take that. And the number two is what is the EU-Turkey deal? Any takers on that?
I can do that.
Okay, cool. And then finally, what is the Dublin regulation? Just take a couple minutes to read up on that. Who wants to do the third one?
I'll do that.
Okay, cool. Again, don't take too long. Just a quick summary for the group, and then we'll move on. All right, do we find anything? Let's start with number one. How many migrants came in last year? Or did you find any numbers in general? It doesn't have to be just last year.
I found for 2018 it said 2.4 million.
Yeah, so that's a lot of people, right? So as you can imagine, because they have such like they have open borders within the EU, once you get into countries, you can just go wherever you want. And so if you're an asylum seeker heading into like Greece, for example, which doesn't have such a strong economy, what do you think you would do next?
Head to a place with a stronger economy.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of makes logical sense that you have financial stability, better social welfare programs, and as a result, countries such as Germany are getting a lot of like migrants. And where did you find they were going?
Um, the biggest immigration populations were Germany, the UK, France, Spain, and Italy.
Yeah, and so you don't see a lot of countries like Greece or like countries like Eastern European countries, for example, on there because they want to flee to those bigger markets with like stronger and more stable economies. So that makes sense. So nice job there. Then what is the EU Turkey deal? Who had that one?
I did. So
Yeah.
the
So what did
EU,
you find?
oh yeah, so the EU Turkey deal was just the EU signed a deal with Turkey, but in order to discourage them from letting more illegal refugees entering the EU, Turkey under this agreement had to take back migrants who entered Greece, but then they could send over legal refugees in the future.
Exactly. So like everyone who came like undocumented or like illegally would have to go back to Turkey. And the problem with this deal is that it was a little shady for the EU because they said like under the premise of the deal, it was like Turkey is a perfectly safe place for asylum seekers to go, which is pretty flawed logic because we'll get into that later. Turkey isn't exactly like a safe place for anyone. So like the EU would be more stable and better off for them, but the EU was again getting overwhelmed with migrants. So like that's their like solution there. All right, and then what is the Dublin regulation?
Yeah, so I did that one. Okay, so the Dublin regulation, it's a European law that determines which member nation is responsible for processing the requests of asylum seekers that come from outside the Union. So generally, so if a migrant enters the EU and goes in through, like, let's say Italy, then that Italy is responsible for sending in the asylum seeker's application and taking their fingerprints. And then these asylum seekers can move within the EU. However, if something comes up and these asylum seekers aren't deemed as like necessary, like they don't actually need asylum, then the country that they entered through can call them back, and then they can send them off, like almost like deporting. And then like a lot of migrants try to like skirt around the system by like not giving their fingerprints or lying, which is what happens in the United States.
Exactly. So like the key here is that the migrant crisis was getting so out of hand that they finally got to a place where like we have to verify whether these people actually need asylum. And like in the United States, like it's very severe now, right? Like in order to seek asylum, like you have to be in a very, very terrible spot. And even then some people are not able to like get access um to the United States, right? So the key here is that like Greece is like one of the big ports for like immigrants to head to. So like now they have to check them before they can head to like other countries, which was better for like the like more developed economies that they were heading to, like France, Germany, for example. But again, it takes still continues to take a huge toll on Greece. All right, any questions there? All right, we'll talk about this later, but like one of the key reasons that Brexit happened in the first place is because the open borders policy was something that was unfavorable to a lot of like um, people in like the UK because they were like the immigrants are coming and taking our jobs, which is like the sentiment we hear across the world, and especially in illiberal democracies, which is a perfect transition to that. Does anyone know what an illiberal democracy is? No one?
Isn't it a democracy where basically civil liberties are guaranteed, but constitutional limits on balance of power aren't?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a part of it, right? Constitutional parts of like balance of power like kind of stops existing. But in some scenarios, you said that civil liberties like are guaranteed. some scenarios like civil liberties are like not guaranteed at all, right? Like freedom of speech is oftentimes suppressed. Opposition and political like opponents are like taken out or like killed or silenced, and then like elections are oftentimes like not entirely free. And so these countries do have elections, which make them a democracy, but they aren't entirely great to begin with. So again, this is a country that has elections, but are places where civil liberties are restricted, um, meaning like there's no oversight for the government, citizens don't know what's happening with the government, and leaders lack full accountability, which is again the balance of power aspect there. Examples of this are Russia. I think most of you would know that elections are not free and fair in Russia. Media is controlled by the state. In Turkey, President Erdogan is controlling everything. Parliament cannot introduce votes of like no confidence in government officials because Erdogan put them there, so they're there. And the president cannot even be investigated by the parliament. President can appoint judges. President can essentially rule by decree. Hungary has shady elections, diminished independent media, less independent judiciary, and then they have a lot of anti-Semitic propaganda. And we're seeing that in Poland as well. Poland recently denied that the Holocaust took place, so there's that. The ruling PIS party is attempting to seize control of the judiciary, claiming that they need more authority to root out remnants of communism, right? So one thing you could see in common here later on is that they will all find one thing that the populace cares about. Poland, for example, has communists that they want to get rid of, so they'll be like, look, give the government more power. This is not in the European Union, but the Philippines, for example, President Rodrigo Duterte is known for his war on drugs. And since like there's a huge drug problem in the country, he's just been given a lot of power, who in turn gives that power to police departments to like kill anyone, just so he could solve the war on drugs. And so like we're seeing this across the world, not just the EU. So let's take a deeper dive into like Hungary's democratic collapse. Basically, there was a democratic transition, but it was riddled with like large economic and social division. And this was primarily in like urban and rural areas, with obviously urban areas getting more money because they develop quicker, they have more people, and that in turn, rural areas are feeling disenfranchised, especially in the countryside. So they borrowed money in Swiss francs because interest rates were lower and the Swiss economy is doing incredibly well. However, in the downturn following the 2008 economic recession, the value of like the Hungarian currency plummeted. What that means is that these loans that they took out in Swiss francs, which was entirely stable, well, not entirely stable, but a lot more stable compared to Hungarian currency, made paying back mortgages and loans basically impossible. So the ruling socialist government had taken on debt because, again, socialism is more like people who are unable to pay for their debt affect the entire country. So it could not intervene to help. And now the president, Viktor Orban, has a conservative party who has power now because basically he solidified his power based on economic reform after the refugee crisis began in 2011. So basically what happens here is that citizens care more and more about the economy, right? The rural area especially was like, look, we're struggling with our loans. We can't really afford anything. So they took out loans. 2008 hit. It made it only worse. The entire Hungarian economy continued to suffer. And so Orban campaigned on this platform saying, look, we're going to provide economic recovery to the country. But since the economy is something that they guaranteed to get better, in return, Hungarian citizens just put blind faith in Orban, and Orban has restricted civil liberties across the country in promises to make the economy better. So once again, the key here is that the people cared about the economy, so Orban came to power campaigning on the economy and now continues to take out some civil liberties. When you look at Poland, income inequality is the main thing here, right? Rural areas, again, are lacking economically compared to urban areas, and they were once supported by Soviet factories, but when cities and urban areas grew wealthier, of course, the economic inequality continued to like get worse and worse. And so the liberal ruling party, again, so you're seeing like liberal governments, like socialist governments, liberal governments being taken out for more conservative ones. They failed to address the problem because their economic reforms were not strong enough. And so PIS was elected, or like given more power, which is a law and justice party. It's more conservative, not only in terms of economics, but they're socially conservative. And so voters did not have a problem with that because, again, they were promised economic stability. And since economics is something that affects every single person in a country, whether you're buying goods, selling goods, trying to make products to sell, it's clear that like that'll be your primary concern in an election. So the generous welfare policies they have like decreased child poverty and helped the economy. But in turn, obviously, the PIS party has restricted civil liberties, as we talked about before, talking about how like they've attempted to seize control of every government institution. I think I accidentally said that they have conservative economic policy. The key here is that they have like more liberal economic policies, which means that they're willing to spend more for like economic growth in the future, but they in turn limit your social rights. So this brings up the question of like why the EU cares about this, right? Why care if the economy of the country is going to do well, and the citizens are fine and they continue to elect these people, right? So first of all, there's a logical flaw behind that statement, right? The citizens don't care seemingly because they continue to elect these officials over and over again. But you have to realize that since like media is suppressed, the opposition doesn't really get a chance to be heard. And B, elections aren't entirely fair in a lot of these states. So the first reason is that the democratic peace theory exists. This is a theory that no two democratic nations have ever gone to war with one another. If you attended the economics lecture, you might have heard of the Golden Arches theory, which is like no two countries with a McDonald's have attacked each other. Besides, I think a war with Georgia and maybe Russia, some conflict there. But that's like related it with capitalism. The same thing goes with democratic nations, right? No two democratic nations have gone to war with one another, so we want to keep all countries in the EU democratic, because when we talk about the foundation of the EU, it was to make sure that nothing like World War II or like Adolf Hitler's aggression ever happens ever again. And in order to make sure that doesn't happen, they have to keep every country democratic. The second part of that is that the EU wants to provide checks and balances because the EU law requires like strict financial management, and leaders who like dismantle their countries like oversight are going to be hard to be held accountable. And then they want to limit separatism, right? Many liberal leaders campaign on leaving the European Union, and that just threatens the core values of the EU in two ways, right? These nationalist campaigns want them to become more independent, and B, you're going to want to leave the European Union, which is not something that's beneficial to the Union. All right, any questions on that aspect before we head into Brexit? Sounds good. All right, Brexit, it's already happened. Let's go through a brief timeline of what's happened, right? A public vote or a referendum happened in 2016 when 17.4 million people opted out for Brexit. I think that came down to 48% or 47% saying that they shouldn't have Brexit, and 52 or 53% saying that they should leave the European Union. And so it obviously ended up passing, but that resulted in two sides being created, a no deal side and a deal side. Does anyone know what the no deal side was or the deal side was?
The European Union without any additional trade or political agreements.
Yeah, exactly. So the no deal side would mean like we don't have to compromise with the European Union on what they want, but we would also lose trade agreements, right? But the deal side would be like we might gain some trade benefits, but on the other hand, we might have to have some open borders of some sort or something the European Union will negotiate with us so that they can also have a favorable deal, right? And then the debate ended up changing to no deal versus remain, because at that point, people were starting to realize, look, this was a very hasty vote. We went very quickly with it. It was just a referendum. Not many people understood like the nuances behind what would happen. So people started to argue that we might want to remain in the European Union because if we're going to get no deal, that's not necessarily worth it for our economy. Um, and that started to prompt a debate around a revote in 2018, but that ended up not happening. Then, in the middle of all these negotiations and all this chaos with Brexit, Theresa May, the Prime Minister of Britain, was replaced by Boris Johnson in July of 2019. And Johnson basically says the UK has had enough of waiting for Brexit. And so while Theresa May is trying to negotiate this deal and pass it through Parliament to make sure that they can actually offer this deal to the European Union, Johnson is basically like, screw it. We're going to try to do Brexit as soon as possible. And so Johnson ends up using as much as he could from Theresa May's deal and adds some of his own and ends up leaving the European Union on January 31st of this year. And that marks the start of a transition period. Any questions on the history? No. All right, cool. Let's talk about the transition period. Basically, now the UK must follow the EU's rules and regulations still until December 31st of this year, while having the same trade benefits. So right now, the UK is basically still in the EU. Besides, by title, they have a few differences, right? That's a big thing because the Department of International Trade explains that 60% of trade for the UK is with EU countries or countries that the EU has trade deals with. So if the EU has a trade deal with a country, that the UK has a trade deal with them right now, because again, these individual countries are not allowed to negotiate their own trade deals with individual countries. So since 49%, I think the breakdown is, of trade from the UK happens with the EU, and I think 11% then happens with countries that are not in the EU, but are countries that have trade deals with the EU. That means that if after the transition period, if there's no deal negotiated before the transition period, those economic trade deals are essentially gone. There's no benefit. There are tariffs added on goods that they have tariffs on for countries without trade deals with that country. Basically, for example, if China has a trade deal with the EU right now, they don't have to pay tariffs to export goods to there or import goods from China. But after December 31st, if the UK does not negotiate a deal with China, they have to pay all the tariffs that China has other countries pay unless there's a trade deal there. And so this is a picture of Angela Merkel a little angry because if there's no free trade deal that can be agreed on, then it could be a problem, right? So can anyone think of what would happen if a free trade deal cannot be reached between the EU and the UK? What would it mean for the economy?
Both economies would be. Oh, all right, you can go.
Supposedly, since the United Kingdom is or was one of the most prominent economies in the European Union, it would allow them less opportunity or less countries able to bail out nations such as Greece.
Yeah, so one aspect of that is that the UK is more stable, right? So talking about how them leaving hurts the European Union's economy, but more so it's if a free trade deal cannot be reached between the two parties, why is that worse for the UK? Well, so it's basically what we just talked about, right? Tariffs are going to happen, right? And not only that, but a lot of aspects that were of daily life in the UK were controlled by the EU. So it's not just trade deals at the line here. Daily functions were impacted. Providing electricity, technology and medicine regulation, aviation rules, law enforcement regulations and rules, and data sharing were all under EU regulations. Now, so what this means is if I'm the UK right now, I have to negotiate a trade deal with the European Union, a trade deal with every country that had a trade deal with the European Union if I want my economy to stay the same. And then I have to take care of all these domestic sectors: electricity, technology, medicine, aviation rules, law enforcement, data sharing, all by the end of this year, because if I don't figure that out, then there's going to be instability after the transition period is over. And then that's the final part here. If that doesn't happen, then what could happen after the transition period is bad. They are talking about extending the transition period, of course, because of COVID and stuff like that, to like April of 2020, I believe. So there is a potential for that to happen, but even then, it's still a lot for the UK to sort out. Um, some red flags that indicate that a negotiation could not happen. This could be something you use in a speech and indicate like there will be no trade deal happening before the transition period ends because recent negotiations between the UK and EU have led to absolutely nothing, right? The chief negotiator for the EU has said that the UK was lacking respect and engagement for these deals and negotiations, which is a bad look for the UK, especially considering these are the people that are going to be struggling the most. And then even the deal was thought to be like easy before like negotiations started, and clearly that is not the case. Um, Another thing that happened is earlier on in negotiations, the EU compromised on like the regulations they would have over the UK's justice system. They agreed that the UK could have their own justice system without any interference or intervening from the European Union and allow basically independence there. But in return, the European Union expected economic like regulations that they had set before to be followed by the UK still. But the miscommunication led to that becoming unclear, and the UK did not really understand that. And so as a result, the UK was like, we do not want those economic regulations, we're not going to go for that. And so basically, because of miscommunications between the two parties, it indicates that the negotiations are not necessarily going well between the two countries or two powers or like entities here, showing that recent negotiations may like result in a no deal situation. Any questions there? Cool. Okay. Now let's get into the economic ramifications, which I know someone asked. I think Piyush, that was you. Let's start with what we already know. How does this hurt trade if there's a no deal situation and the transition period results in nothing?
So the transfer of goods between the UK or Great Britain and the EU would be greatly harmed, right? Because there would be more trade restrictions between both countries because goods can't flow as easy.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the flow of goods becomes a lot more stringent because they have to go through customs and everything. It costs more to export and import, and it's just a whole nother hassle to do that, right? So if they can't negotiate that, then that has a problem. Why might consumers and foreign investors be a little uncertain in like investing or like being confident to spend in the UK? Any ideas there? No? Okay, so first thing, consumer confidence is if Brexit is happening and I don't know what the trade deals of my country are going to be with other countries, then I don't know whether or not I should like invest in stocks, stuff like that. And so big purchases might be something that people stay away from as they might be saving up money now. So that means that there's less economic growth as less capital flows throughout the economy. And it also means that foreign investment decreases. When someone invests in an economy, they're investing because they want to get a profit back. They want their investment to grow over time so that they can sell it for a profit and keep the money, right? But in a country where there is a lack of trade deals and uncertainty whether or not they're going to have stability later on, then there's some uncertainty. And so foreign investment goes down, also decreasing the economic growth rate. And that really ties into the last point there. Any questions on the economics of the EU, the UK because of this? I know there were some questions earlier. Does this answer them? All right, sounds good. And then I'd like to take a brief, like, few minutes, like, discuss the EU after Merkel. This has been like a pretty big discussion that's been happening across the international community. And does anyone know why? Why after Merkel? Does anyone know what's happening to Merkel?
Merkel is more like she's like is it like she's lame duck or sitting duck? Which one is called?
I think it's lame duck.
Okay, lame duck. She's still chancellor, but she isn't participating in any political affairs as she's gonna step down. And considering she was one of like the leading political figures in the EU, there could be like a huge disaster or like a power vacuum essentially for like a leadership position.
Yeah, that was a very good explanation, actually, Canucks. So nice job there. Um, and that's basically what I had written down. It creates a power vacuum. So Angela Merkel is the chancellor of Germany right now. But in 2021, she announced she would not be seeking like re-election or not be seeking another term. This creates two problems. First, the person who is seen as the leader as of the EU is no longer going to be the leader because they're not even going to be a leader in Germany. And so the leader of a country is the leader of the EU, typically, de facto leader. They aren't like elected. They just get to be the head of the European Union. And Merkel was that for years on end, providing stability not only to Germany, but also the EU. Second, with the UK gone out of the European Union, Germany is weakened with Angela Merkel gone, and as a result, France seems to be the next best option. And so a lot of like magazine articles and like think tanks have started to look to Macron, the president of France, to see whether or not he'd be a suitable leader. And then a third option, or third point that I brought up here, that I didn't bring up here rather, that I'd like to bring up just discussing is what Pinnock brought up about being like a lame duck leader or like a lame duck president, chancellor, prime minister, whatever. What this basically means is that Merkel announced that she's going to retire in 2021. And so she's not involved in political affairs. That's pretty dangerous because Merkel cannot really be legitimized on the political stage anymore. If I announce, like, look, I'm president of the United States, but I'm not going to be seeking re-election, people are going to be automatically thinking, look, this president is going to last long, so we just got to outwait this presidency and then we'll be fine. We'll get what's done. We get what we want to get done after the presidency. So as a result, it's something to think about there. So she's oftentimes delegitimized in German politics as well. So again, the power vacuum is looking to be filled by France, the leader of France, Emmanuel Macron. The issue there is that Macron wants an integrated EU. That sounds like a great thing, right? And don't get me wrong, like the EU should stick together, but his definition of integration is actually quite different. It's rather isolation because he wants to strengthen the defense of the EU and no longer rely on the US, right? And Macron even went as far as to say, like late in 2019, that he wants the EU to form its own military, right? And the Europeans are worried because rather than focusing on isolating themselves right now, most European countries believe that they need to focus on working together with other strong allies to make sure that the European Union can stay stable, continue to grow, and continue to prosper. And the last thing is, Merkel was in charge of Germany, one of the most stable countries across the European Union. But now, Macron is the second best option here. And we're seeing that France isn't exactly doing entirely well under Macron, right? It's not doing well economically. There have been protests. So socially, there are issues. And as a result, people are doubting Macron's credibility. And so basically, that's all I want to touch upon in terms of like leadership for the EU, issues across the EU, and how you can maybe answer questions about the EU based off the context that you have. Does anyone have any questions? All right, in that case, I'm going to stop this recording